Uncut tunnel footage revealed a shadow moving deep inside a passage, thought to be sealed, and the shape turned toward the light as if aware before fading into the stone. And now investigators fear the rumor Josh Gates followed for years may be real, so stay here and subscribe before the footage is buried again. The chamber responded with a soft, rising tremor, as if something ancient beneath the passage stirred at the sight, and the moment hinted at a truth investigators feared now shown. The team returned to the canyon entrance with attention that clung to every step, each investigator aware that the uncut tunnel footage had changed the mission entirely. What was once a simple documentation run had shifted into something far more unsettling, because the shadow captured on camera was not a trick of light nor a drifting blur from dust or debris. It moved with intention, it turned toward the lens, and it vanished into stone in a way that defied every natural law the crew trusted to keep them safe underground. The chamber air hung heavy with the smell of damp earth and old mineral dust, but beneath it lurked a colder undercurrent, a faint metallic taste that some explorers describe seconds before faint electromagnetic disturbances begin. Equipment readings jittered as the crew crossed the threshold, the handheld sensors flickering with unstable spikes that rose and flattened in irregular patterns, as if responding to their presence rather than the environment. Josh Gates had followed stories like this for years. Stories of tunnels that seemed to breathe, passages where sound warps and shadows stretch in ways no human movement can explain. And tonight, those rumors pressed into reality with an uncomfortable closeness. The deeper they walked, the stronger the hum became, a low vibration pushing through the soles of their boots and climbing into their legs like a slow current searching for an anchor. The tunnel walls seemed to ripple in the beam of the flashlight, not physically shifting, but bending light in thin, wavering sheets that reacted whenever the crew spoke or moved. A decade of whispered theories suddenly felt less like exaggerations and more like buried warnings left behind by those who had come here before. And somewhere ahead, beyond the curve of the passage, the camera had recorded the moment the shadow paused as if listening to the team. Now the crew approached that same spot, with every nerve drawn tight, knowing that if the footage was authentic, something within this tunnel had been waiting for them long before the lights were turned on. The crew slowed as they reached the bend in the tunnel, the place where the footage first captured the impossible movement. A brief frame of distortion sliding across the stone as though the wall itself had shifted to let something pass. The flashlight beams quivered against uneven rock, yet the surface ahead remained unnervingly smooth, worn not by water or time, but by something that had moved through it with silent precision. Rumors had long whispered of an older network beneath this canyon, a lattice of passages carved by unknown hands or forces, tunnels that investigators claimed to hear breathing when left alone in the dark. The idea was always dismissed as folklore, but tonight the air carried a faint rhythmic pulse, subtle enough to mistake for imagination, until the vibration crawled along the floor and brushed against their boots in a slow, deliberate sweep. The equipment operator raised a thermal camera toward the wall, expecting nothing more than cold stone. Yet the screen flickered with a thin vertical streak of heat, as if some presence had pressed against the rock only moments before. No animal could move like that. No person could slip through stone with such fluid motion. And yet the evidence glowed in front of them, a signature that refused to fade. Someone whispered that the shadow in the footage had turned its head, but no one wanted to admit they had seen the same unsettling angle in the replay. The deeper theory suggested that whatever lived in these tunnels did not travel by walking, but by slipping between layers of the earth itself, moving through fractures and voids that scanners failed to detect. The hum grew stronger, echoing through the chamber in low waves that touched their ribs and tightened the air around their throats. The ground shifted underfoot, not in a collapse, but in a controlled settling, as though the tunnel adjusted its posture in response to the team. And for the first time, every investigator felt it. The sense that they were no longer documenting a mystery but disturbing one, and that the thing captured in the uncut footage was not retreating, it was approaching. A cold drift of air slid through the tunnel as the crew advanced, though no one could find the source. Underground chambers rarely breathe, yet this one exhaled in slow, deliberate intervals, each pulse rolling across the dust in faint spirals that curled around their boots. steps before dissolving into the dark. The team exchanged silent looks, each knowing the behavior aligned disturbingly well with older rumors collected from miners and explorers who claimed the canyon's subsurface felt alive, shifting in ways no natural formation should. Josh Gates had heard those stories for years, accounts of shadows moving against the grain of light, of narrow passageways that changed shape between one visit and the next. But he had never seen a case where the evidence pressed so close to confirmation. The thermal streak lingering on the wall behind them refused to cool, and its heat signature seemed to stretch downward, as if drawn by some unseen passage burrowed beneath the floor. The camera operator lifted his lens again, catching a faint shimmer low to the ground, a distortion that flickered like heat rising from asphalt despite the heavy chill filling the tunnel. Then the hum shifted. What had been a broad vibration dissolved into a thin, oscillating tone that pulsed through the chamber in measured intervals, a pattern that mimicked the rhythm captured in the uncut footage, just before the shadow appeared. The moment the tone stabilized, the dust near the far wall rippled, lifting in a gentle arc as though something on the other side were pressing outward. The crew froze, lights steady, breath held, watching as the stone surface seemed to flex in a subtle inward pull. It was not enough to call movement, but enough to strip any comfort of coincidence. One investigator whispered that it felt like the tunnel was listening. Another insisted they should retreat before the pressure grew stronger. But the path ahead remained open, the darkness drawing them forward, and the possibility that the footage had captured a real entity, one that lived within the fractures of this canyon, pulled them deeper into the unknown. The tunnel narrowed as the crew pushed deeper, the walls closing in with a quiet pressure that felt less like geology and more like intention, as though the stone were adjusting around them in slow, measured breaths. Their lights skimmed across mineral veins and pockets of fractured rock, yet every few feet the texture changed abruptly, smoothed into unnatural curves as if something had passed through recently and reshaped the surface in silence. These formations matched the descriptions found in old field notes and archived rumors, reports of subterranean corridors that seemed carved not by tools or erosion, but by movement itself, as though some presence traveled through the earth by folding around it rather than cutting into it. Josh Gates had always treated such claims with healthy skepticism, but tonight the tunnel carried a strange coherence, the hum rising in a controlled oscillation that felt purposeful. The equipment in the rear of the group responded instantly. Electromagnetic readings surged in sweeping arcs, while the ground sensor captured faint tremors that pulsed with a rhythm too steady to be random. When the team rounded another bend, the tone deepened into a low resonant thrum that vibrated through their chests and crawled along their arms, a sensation far stronger than any natural acoustic reflection. Then, the distortion appeared again. A faint vertical shimmer stood several feet ahead, hovering just above the ground like a curtain of bending air. It was taller than before, its outline sharper, its movement synchronized perfectly with the rhythm shaking the tunnel. The shimmer tilted, not in a chaotic flicker, but in a controlled lean, as if its attention shifted toward the advancing lights. One of the investigators lifted a camera, the beam of the spotlight cutting through the distortion for a single shivering moment before the shape recoiled deeper into the darkness. The dust at their feet rose in a soft circular ripple, tightening inward before settling as though recording the retreat of whatever had been standing there. And for the first time that night, the crew sensed they were no longer following a trail of old rumors. They were walking directly into the territory of something that might not want them there. The crew hesitated at the point where the distortion had withdrawn, not because the way ahead was blocked, but because the tunnel beyond seemed subtly altered, as though the passage had stretched. In the seconds their lights were fixed on the shimmering outline, the air grew colder, settling on their skin in an almost electric stillness, and the hum that had filled the chamber fractured into two overlapping tones, one low and steady, the other thin and wavering, like a signal shifting between frequencies. Investigators familiar with underground acoustics whispered that such behavior had been reported before in these canyons, always tied to stories of unseen chambers that resonated with strange internal pressure. But tonight, the sound felt too focused to dismiss, as a geological quirk. The dust ahead lifted again, swirling into a narrow column that twisted once before falling still, leaving the sense that something had just moved without making a sound. Josh Gates had cataloged countless claims from explorers who insisted the tunnels possessed their own kind of awareness, a subtle reaction to movement or breath, but even he had never encountered a case where the environment itself seemed to anticipate every step. The cameras continued recording as the investigators pressed forward, their lights cutting through a corridor that grew smoother and more uniform with each passing yard, as if shaped by something that preferred precision over chaos. Then, the tone deepened once more, and the far wall flexed with a soft inward pull, not enough to warp the rock, but enough to suggest pressure from the other side. One of the crew members raised a hand for silence, pointing to a thin seam running horizontally along the floor, a feature not present on earlier scans, and one that resembled the edge of a chamber door more than a natural crack. No one dared approach it, yet the closer they looked, the more the seam seemed to pulse with faint internal light, a glow that brightened with each oscillation of the hum. And in that moment, the team realized the uncut footage might not have captured a passing shadow at all, but the first glimpse of an entrance long rumored to exist, a threshold not meant to be found, and perhaps never meant to be crossed. The seam along the tunnel floor seemed to pulse faster as the crew drew closer, each faint flicker of light rising through the crack like a heartbeat buried beneath layers of ancient stone. No one could confirm whether it was geological fluorescence or something far more engineered, yet the glow moved with too much rhythm to dismiss as a natural trick of minerals. The hum shifted again, dropping into a heavy resonant throb that pressed against their ribs and settled into the air like a warning. Investigators exchanged uneasy glances, recalling the long-standing theory whispered among canyon researchers that some of these underground anomalies behaved less like empty passages and more like controlled systems, structures capable of sensing vibrations and responding through pressure waves. Josh Gates had encountered dozens of claims pointing to such phenomena, but the living quality of this seam surpassed anything recorded in his archives. As the crew steadied their lights, the dust at their feet lifted into narrow spirals that drifted toward the glowing line, pulled as though by a subtle gravitational thread. The rock surrounding the seam began to warm under their touch, a slow, spreading heat that contradicted the cold breath exhaling from deeper within the tunnel. One investigator knelt beside the crack, noting how the stone tapered into unnaturally smooth edges, as if carved from beneath by something that moved with fluid precision. The hum thickened into layered tones, each rising and falling in perfect sync with the glow, forming a pattern too clean to be random. Then the ground shifted, not in a collapse or tremor, but in a deliberate settling motion that pushed a soft wave of pressure through the chamber and forced everyone to brace themselves against the walls. The seam widened by a fraction of an inch, exposing a darker void beneath, and the glow intensified into a faint vertical shimmer that rose from the gap like the beginning of a threshold forming. A theory flickered through the team, one whispered by explorers who believed the tunnels were not static at all but responsive, opening and closing according to triggers no one had yet understood. And as the chamber tightened around them, the investigators realized they may have activated one of those triggers, calling forth something the canyon had kept sealed for decades. A cold draft poured from the widening seam, drifting across the tunnel floor in a low, creeping sweep that moved with too much intention to be mistaken for displaced air. The crew stepped back instinctively, raising their lights as the glow beneath the stone brightened into a thin vertical strand that climbed upward in slow, measured pulses, almost as if something beneath the passage were attempting to lift the door from within. The hum deepened again, settling into a layered vibration that pressed against their chests and curled around their arms like a living current, mapping every contour it touched. Rumors from past expeditions spoke of hidden chambers that responded to sound, structures that opened only when exposed to certain tones or environmental shifts. But no one expected to witness behavior that matched those theories so precisely. Josh Gates had heard countless variations of these claims, stories of explorers who felt watched underground, of chambers that seemed to inhale and exhale. But this moment eclipsed all of them. the seam expanded another fraction as the rock surrounding it flexed inward with a slow, mechanical grace, revealing a deeper darkness below, a void that swallowed their light with unsettling ease. An investigator extended a probe toward the gap, only to watch the beam of the device bend slightly as it neared the opening, the light distorting in a thin, shimmering arc that suggested an electromagnetic field, or something equally unknown. The dust around the seam rose again, circling upward in a soft spiral that tightened as if drawn toward an unseen center point. The hum shifted into a narrow oscillation that repeated in precise intervals, a signal pattern too deliberate to dismiss as random resonance. The deeper theory, the one discussed only in private labs and late-night conversations, claimed that if tunnels existed beneath this canyon, they were not remnants of geology, but remnants of design, an infrastructure built by something that moved differently than any living species known to science. As the lights flickered and the chamber squeezed into another long exhale, the crew realized they were no longer observing a passive anomaly. They were standing at the threshold of a system responding to their presence, and whatever stirred beneath the seam was no longer waiting for them to act. It was preparing to rise. The seam widened with a slow, grinding sigh as the tunnel floor shifted in a precise, deliberate motion, the kind of controlled movement no natural fault line could replicate. The glow rising from the gap flickered in tight rhythmic pulses, illuminating the swirling dust that drifted downward as though answering a silent summons. The hum fractured into two distinct tones again, one low and steady, the other thin and trembling, and together they formed a vibration that crawled across the stone walls in rippling waves. The crew stared as their equipment spiked in sharp vertical lines, registering electromagnetic distortion at levels far beyond the shallow anomalies they had recorded earlier. One investigator whispered the oldest theory tied to this canyon, a claim suggesting the tunnels were not built but grown, shaped by forces beneath the earth that left behind smooth corridors and seamless thresholds. Josh Gates had dismissed that idea more than once, but here the stone seemed to move with a biological patience, expanding the seam inch by inch, as if responding to a signal he could not hear. When the gap reached a width wide enough to peer through, the lights were raised, revealing a narrow descending shaft lined with impossibly smooth surfaces, each one curving downward in spirals that looked more engineered than carved. The dust inside the shaft did not fall. It drifted sideways, drawn into the darkness by an unseen current that defied the still air surrounding them. The hum shifted deeper, resonating so strongly it vibrated through the crew's boots and pressed into their legs like a rising internal pressure. The shimmering distortion appeared again within the shaft itself, its outline collapsing and reforming in fluid ripples that stretched toward the opening in slow, tentative gestures. And with each movement, the shaft brightened with a faint silver glow, revealing markings along the inner walls, patterns that looked less like symbols and more like the natural geometry of something grown rather than constructed. The crew stepped back, realizing that the rumored tunnel network might not be metaphor or exaggeration after all. It might be alive in ways they had never considered and awakening in ways they were not prepared to witness. The glow inside the shaft intensified until the spiraling walls shimmered with a pale metallic sheen, revealing movement far below, a slow drifting shadow rising through the column like a figure ascending through water. The crew froze, their lights trembling against the edge of the opening as the hum narrowed into a single focused tone that vibrated through their teeth and tightened the air around their lungs. Dust lifted in thin vertical strands, pulled toward the shaft as if the darkness were drawing breath, and the temperature dropped with a sudden bite that prickled across their arms. The shadow rose higher, its outline wavering in fluid collapses that hinted at shape without revealing it, and with every inch gained the pressure in the tunnel thickened until the stone around them seemed to flex in subtle, rhythmic pulses. Someone whispered that the entity was responding to the light. Another insisted it was reacting to the sound, but everyone agreed on the one truth forming with unbearable clarity. The footage had not captured a fleeting anomaly, but a documented interaction, the first undeniable moment where the underground network had answered back. The hum peaked in a sharp oscillation, forcing the crew to step away from the seam as the shadow reached the upper curve of the shaft, hovering just beyond the boundary between the darkness below and the fractured beam of their flashlights. For several long seconds, the shape tilted as if studying them, the air bending in thin ripples around its form, and then the tone collapsed into silence so sudden it felt like the tunnel itself had exhaled. The glow dimmed, the pressure ebbed, and the shadow slipped downward in a smooth retreat that vanished into the spiraling depths as if it had never surfaced at all. The seam began to close, the stone folding inward with slow, deliberate strokes until the gap sealed with a final low thrum that echoed through the chamber like a warning swallowed by the earth. When the lights steadied and the hum faded to memory, the crew understood what the uncut footage truly confirmed. The rumors were not exaggerations. The theories were not mistakes. Something intelligent moved beneath these tunnels, something that had waited for years for an observer who could finally see it. And tonight, Expedition X had crossed its path.